Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Eleanor Pete, and I am president of the PARI Center. We are honored today to hold this conversation between Bernardo Kastrup and Rupert Sheldrake on Is Idealism Enough? And today will be chaired by Alex Gomez-Marin. Alex Gomez-Marin is a Spanish scientist and theoretical physicist turned neuroscientist investigating human consciousness. Since 2016, he has been the director of Organisms Behavior Laboratory at the Institute of Neuroscience in Alicante, where he is currently an associate professor at the Spanish Research Council. Since 2022, Alex has also been director of the PARI Center. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Alex. Welcome.
Thank you, Eleanor. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you again and to host this very special event. I'm used to conversations one-on-one, as you may know, and this is going to be a trialogue, although I feel more like a deluxe spectator or mediator between a conversation really between two people I truly admire. A disclaimer here, I'm friend with Rupert. I talk to him very often. And so I have more than a professional relationship, one could say, with Rupert. I consider him a dear friend. And I'm not a friend of Bernardo, but I admire him same. I think the work he's been doing has been very important for philosophy, for science, and for culture writ large. So I'm super happy to do this today. I'll introduce both of them in a moment. Let me say first something about the spirit of this encounter, because we're used, perhaps because of social media and clickbait and attention spans and going down to certain emotions, we're used to liking people fight. And of course, intellectuals, we also fight with ideas. And it's good that we do that, even necessary. But I don't see these as let's see who wins at all. There'd be a little bit of clash, but I see this as an opportunity to learn, to go deeper, be more sophisticated about our thinking, and using this friction that has happened recently, and they'll tell us about it, to create not only a bit of heat, but some light on things that I think we all share. I think in a way, most of us who are here today, and it's about 200 people live and more have registered to receive the recording. It's that we know we're leaving behind materialism. Materialism is dying, if not dead, or in a terminal lucidity state. So we share what we're running away from, but it's not clear to me at this point exactly where we want to head. And there are other avenues in front of us, and idealism is a major one. And so today we'll have an opportunity to kind of refine this sense of where we're going. About the structure of this event before I introduce formally Rupert and Bernardo. So they will be talking for about an hour, however long we have. If we finish early, we were saying before starting, we'll finish early and we can go to have dinner. And we'll open it up in the end for 30 minutes. So you'll have an opportunity to ask your question, make your comment, and hear from them at the end. And also I want to emphasize that it's really exciting that this is recorded, will be unedited, unless something really strange happens. And it's live, and it has a live audience. So I think that adds a little bit more of presence to it. All right. So they really don't need introduction, and that's not just rhetorical. But I'll introduce them anyways. So Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist and author of more than 100 technical papers and 12 books, including Science and Spiritual Practices. A former research fellow of the Royal Society, he studied natural sciences at Cambridge University, where he took a PhD in biochemistry, and philosophy at Harvard University, where he was a Frank Knox Fellow. He was a fellow of the Clare College, Cambridge, and director of studies in cell biology. From 2005 to 2010, he was director of the Perrott-Warwick Project, funded by Trinity College, Cambridge, for research on unexplained human and animal abilities. He's currently a fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences near San Francisco, and also of Schumacher College in Devon. And for more information, you can visit his website, sheldrake.org. Bernardo Kastrup is the executive director of Essentia Foundation, His work has set off the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. He has a PhD in philosophy and another PhD in computer engineering. As a scientist, Bernardo has worked at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, and the Philips Research Laboratories. He has also been creatively active in the high-tech industry for almost 30 years now, having co-founded parallel processor company Silicon Hive and worked as a technology strategist for the geopolitical significant company ASML. Bernardo has most recently started an AI hardware company, Synthetics BV, currently in stealth mode. Formulated in detail in many academic papers and books, Bernardo's ideas have been featured at Scientific American, the Institute of Arts and Ideas, the blog of the American Philosophical Association, and Big Thing, amongst others. Bernardo's 11th book, coming in 2024, is Analytic, Idealism in a Nutshell, a straightforward summary of 21st century only plausible metaphysics. For more information, you can also download his work at bernardokastrup.com. All right. So I'm with you, dear friends, and I'll open it up, and maybe you can just start by providing a little bit of context to the audience about why are we talking about idealism today, because I'm not sure they will all have read or listened to the comments that Rupert made in Curt Jaimungal, and then the reaction that Bernardo had, and then the response that Rupert had. So if you would like to start by just briefly putting us to speed as to what has been the recent clash, and then we can go and clarify all these very aspects about idealism and so on. Thank you for being here.
Do you want to go first, Bernardo?
Maybe you.
Okay. Okay, we want Alex asked for the context. Well, the context is that I've read quite a number of Bernardo's books. He and I have had a previous discussion online that was mediated by a Belgian philosopher, Jonas Atlas. I'm very impressed by the way he's managed to put across idealism in a plausible way. I mean, he says so himself on the cover of his book. We differ about whether it's the only plausible metaphysics, but it's certainly plausible, and it's well argued, and it's a hard sell. I mean, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have thought it possible for anyone to launch idealism in the modern world in a way that was credible and persuasive. And Bernardo is credible and he is persuasive. And what's more, he's actually persuaded a lot of people who were previously materialists to open up to a quite different way of thinking. So that's the background, the first part of the background. The second part of the background is I was interviewed by Curt Jaimungal, who has a series of YouTubes called Theory of Everything. He and I spent 2 or 3 days together at a philosophy festival in London, and we spent quite a lot of time just sort of chatting informally. We got on very well. And then he wanted to interview me for his show. So we did the interview. The reason I mentioned the background is that when we did the interview, I was so used to talking to him, I just went on talking to him as if it was just us. Well, that was, I suppose, the illusion that these shows are supposed to create, but not the reality they're meant to be. What I did was talk to him as if our whole of our previous conversation was taken for granted and we could carry on from where we left off. And we'd been talking about Bernardo. So I spoke in a way that really didn't give the full background to the people who were listening who might not even have heard of Bernardo or didn't know about his philosophy. So I spoke in a way that was perhaps too abrupt and with too little context. But I made some points of disagreement with Bernardo's philosophy. One of them, these are things we're, I hope, going to discuss. One of them was about the role of reductionism in science. I've spent years fighting against the reductionist approach in biology, molecular biology, which I think severely distorts the entire field of biology and psychology. And Bernardo, in his book, Analytical Idealism, endorses reductionism. But the fact is that his own approach is certainly not that of an old-style limited reductionist. And in some of his own writing, especially the book I like most really of his, More Than Allegory, he portrays a kind of visionary scientific enterprise that's actually almost coming true at the moment. But it's a case of life imitating art, of a kind of network of people doing psychedelic research, infusing intravenously powerful psychedelics. Well, I mean, in Bernardo's case, it was a kind of fiction about a research possibility to explore consciousness, but it's actually happening. I mean, there's a intravenous DMT infusion project going on at Imperial College London, where this wild, far-out program of psychedelic research that, when I read it in Bernardo's book, I thought, well, gosh, that might conceivably happen in many years' time. I hadn't expected it to happen legally in an established university in London, almost straight away. I mean, it started very soon after his book came out. I don't know if they read the book. I think probably it's Independent Evolution. Anyway, the people who were volunteers for this program were very brave, and it did happen. So Bernardo is actually quite wildly visionary scientifically. But in his book, he tries to, well, maybe just trying to come across as being scientifically conservative, not pressing alarm buttons unnecessarily. Probably a good policy. But the thing is, it did press a button for me, because any defense of reductionism triggers me, because I've spent so many years trying to go beyond it. The second point, really, that I brought up in my comments to Curt Jaimungal was really to do with the claim that was triggered by the claim on the cover of Bernardo's very readable and admirably brief book. It is in a nutshell. I mean, he doesn't waste time. He gets to reductionism on page 2. But the claim, the 21st century's only plausible metaphysics. Well, possibly idealism, arguably, is perhaps the only plausible metaphysics, although personally, I think one has to take seriously panpsychism and panentheism as other approaches. And even among idealism, there are very various brands of idealism. And so I thought this was perhaps rather trying to claim the entire ground, to claim total victory against all other idealist and other non-physicalist philosophies, just by asserting it, just by saying it on the cover of the book, because it doesn't actually argue in the book about what's wrong with all these other kinds of idealism or panpsychisms, or it's just taken for granted this is the only one. So that was slightly triggering for me, because I thought, there are all these other things, and I don't suppose that Bernardo will actually defend the position that this is the only credible, his particular brand of idealism is the only credible philosophy that's going to serve us for the next 75 years. So perhaps it's an exaggerated claim. Anyway, those were what the things that lay behind the comments I made in this interview with Curt Jaimungal in his Theory of Everything podcast. And I'm glad that what's happened has happened, because it means that we now have this opportunity to discuss in more detail what was going on. But anyway, that's my side of the story, but we should hear Bernardo's side now.
I have been reading and listening to Rupert since many years before Bernardo Kastrup was a thing at all. So for me, this is a special opportunity to be sitting across the virtual table from him. You are not going to see today my usual fighting style, because it just doesn't come through in current presence. But I will say this, I'm never insincere. So my defense of reductionism was sincere. It's just that I define reductionism in a very specific way. Reductionism today is normally understood as explaining big things in terms of small things. I think that's a completely failed project. We have known in physics since the 1940s, since quantum electrodynamics, that there are no irreducible small things. At the end of the reduction chain, it's all fields, and fields are spatially unbound. And you run into all kinds of not only philosophical, but scientific problems if you don't embrace this understanding. So for me, reductionism is reducing the complex to the simpler. And I am sincere in defending that. It's not just, to attract attention or I don't think even it contradicts the book you do like, which is more than allegory. I think my defense of reductionism is compatible with that book. I think, for the past 400 years, we have been very successful in explaining complex things in terms of simpler things. And I think that's a promising project. I'm comfortable continuing to do that. So for me, reductionism is, can we reduce the apparent complexity and variety of nature down to the properties or archetypes of one field of subjectivity? In physics, this would be called the unified field attempt. There are many grand unification theories in physics today. Many of them are not promising at all, but there are so many and so different avenues that I think it's plausible that one day it will succeed and we will bring all the 17 quantum fields and gravity together into something that is unitary. So that's the spirit of my reductionism. It's not at all, it's even contrary to the normal colloquial spirit of reductionism, which is to reduce everything, including mind, down to molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles. I think that is not only failed, it is almost a preposterous project, given what we know from physics and biology and philosophy today. So I will honor my defense of reductionism in that sense, complex to the simpler, not big to the small. There are no irreducible small things in nature. Philosophical discourse, and now I'm trying to I'll begin my journey to try to approach Rupert's position. Philosophical discourse is always predicated on a certain level of concessions. We can never try to speak truth without making some concessions, because if you don't make concessions, you can't open your mouth. And that's the problem of Zen Buddhism. They try not to make any concessions, so they can't speak. They can only point. So let me give you some examples of those concessions. A big one is Aristotelian logic. Aristotelian logic is a set of 5 axioms that seem to be self-evident, but you cannot logically argue for the validity of logical axioms, because that immediately begs the question. It's a form of circular reasoning. So strictly speaking, from a rational perspective, logic is arbitrary. What it has going for it is that it seems to work empirically most of the time, but it's on very shaky grounds. Even Russell and Whitehead found it out when they tried to base the whole of number theory in logic, and then comes von Neumann around a few years later and then just makes the whole edifice collapse. So when we argue philosophically, analytically, we are already making a non-trivial concession to the 5 axioms of Aristotelian logic. But if you don't make a concession to some logic, you cannot weave an argument, because an argument is based on logical axioms. Another concession we often make by necessity, what we make all the time if we want to open our mouths and speak, is to the existence of space and time. Because space-time is built into language. Events can be described by verbs if you assume time. The distinction between subject and object, which is built into language, presupposes the existence of space. And there is a number of other concessions that one normally makes. And here's another one, just to make it exhaustive. A concession to not applying first-person insight and intuition in your argument, because those are very difficult to share, if at all shareable. And we make this concession that the rule of the game is such that what my interlocutor cannot have access to, I cannot leverage in my argument because it then comes across as arbitrary, which of course doesn't mean that there is no validity to first-person insight and intuition. Why wouldn't there be? We are living beings rooted in nature, and we are rooted in nature through layers of psyche that are phylogenetically speaking much older than the rational mind. Those are the intuitive roots that link us to reality. So it's entirely valid for building our own worldview and the way we relate to the world to leverage our own first-person intuitive insight. In philosophical discourse, that's conceded. We give that up because it's very hard to communicate by leveraging that without coming across as arbitrary. So in this latest book that Rupert criticized, I made all of these concessions. And I don't say that explicitly in the book because I've said that in many other occasions that a philosophical discourse is based on concessions. In the book that Rupert likes more than allegory, I made less concessions. I even tried not to concede space-time, even though I was writing in language. It is a tricky thing to do. And I probably failed, but at least tried that. I didn't make a concession to logic. I did not make a concession to space-time. And I opened the door wide open to first-person intuitive insight. I don't think the two books are contradictory, but my reaction to Rupert's criticism was basically centered on what I felt were not proper characterizations of analytic idealism. I was not fundamentally against what I know Rupert's position to be. Which is largely based on intuitive first-person insight. I honor that. I think it's important for any healthy human being to honor that too. It's just not something that I can use in analytic discourse because it goes against the accepted rules of the game. In other words, I'm closer to Rupert than anybody would guess if all they read was my reaction to Rupert's comments.
I'm keeping track of the two main points that Rupert mentioned, reductionism and plausibility. And I have two more that I also recall from the dialogue and that I'd also like us to discuss, which is naturalism and also falsifiability, prediction. This is philosophy, but it also intersects with science. So let's have in the horizon these four big points. But while we're on reduction...
I can tackle them very quickly. Like
you want to do that? Okay.
Yeah. Again, I am sincere. In the book, the latest book, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell, I do have an entire chapter dedicated to bringing down panpsychism. Rupert is correct that there are other formulations of idealism that largely overlap with analytic idealism, that have some parts that are not common, but they don't contradict analytic idealism either. You can think of certain versions of cosmopsychism or blob theory, as sometimes it's called in philosophy. So those are plausible too. I grant that, but in granting that, I'm not contradicting the notion that analytic idealism, in my view, is the only plausible approach, because those are not really entirely distinguishable from analytic idealism. And of course, claims in the book cover tend to be very firm. But I don't dishonor the claim. I'm not withdrawing from that claim. I agreed with that claim, so I honor that. Now, regarding naturalism and the other values that I espouse in the latest book, the feeling I have, and Rupert can correct me if he is wrong, Rupert characterized analytic idealism as sort of physicalism-like, because analytic idealism espouses these other values that physicalism does espouse, like you mentioned one, naturalism. My feeling is that Rupert gives too much to physicalism. I refuse to grant physicalism any sort of ownership of exclusivity on naturalism or reductionism or rationalism. I don't grant that to physicalism, even though we grew up in a society that does grant it, and we got used to it. I think fundamentally there is no reason to grant that to physicalism. There are many other approaches to metaphysics that are naturalist, that are rationalist, they are reductionist, and all that stuff. So, in not granting that, I'm not comfortable with saying that analytic idealism is physicalism-like, because to ground that statement, I would have to make that grant, which I refuse to do.
Okay, well, thank you, Bernardo. I mean, there are quite a lot of different points here. And perhaps, to avoid jumbling everything up, I'd take them in order. And reductionism of the complex to the simple. Now, I mean, I take your point, you don't mean reductionism in the crudest ways that it's usually applied. But, I'm a biologist, and, when I hear physicists talking about grand unified theories that would bring together all the different particles together in a theory, I read that in people, even Lee Smolin, who's a kind of liberal physicist and whose work I like and enjoy reading, at one stage says, once we've brought together all the particles in a unified theory, we've got the basis for physics, and then once we've got that, chemistry is just plain sailing, and that gives the whole of biology and life and stuff. So as if the whole of reality can be reduced to fundamental particle physics. And he's one of the more liberal ones. I mean, he's not a kind of fire-breathing sort of ultra-reductionist. He's probably one of the more dissident and thoughtful figures in theoretical physics.
He's an idealist.
Is he an idealist now?
It's hard to avoid that conclusion when he says qualia states, present qualia states are all that exist.
I see. Well, he may be an idealist without knowing it, but perhaps perhaps the next dialogue that Alex does would be between you and Smolin, and then we get to the bottom of that. But the thing is that Stephen Hawking did the same thing. Once you've got a theory of everything about fundamental physics, then, the whole of chemistry, biology, and rest is just solved. Well, I've spent years and years and years hearing people say that kind of thing. And that's why molecular biologists have basically taken over biology. There's been, when I first studied biology at Cambridge, in the botany school where I studied plants, there were botanists who could actually recognize plants. You could go out in the field with them. They knew the names of plants. They knew their life cycles. And so nowadays, most of them can only sequence DNA and enzymes and things in test tubes. So, the plants, it's now been rebranded the Department of Plant Science or Plant Sciences. And it's all about molecular biology. So there's been a kind of takeover of almost the whole of biology by molecular biology, who get the funding, the prestige, etc. And on the grounds that you can explain all life in terms of molecules because they're simpler than complex living organisms. Now, the alternative way of looking at things, or the main alternative, is a holistic approach that says at every level the whole is more than the sum of the parts. A cell is more than the sum of the organelles and so on. Tissue more than the cells, an organ more than the tissues, an organism more than all the different organs and their interactions, and a society of organisms like a flock of starlings more than just the individual birds. So if you have that generally holistic approach, it's a kind of nested holarchy. There's a series of levels where the larger levels actually include the smaller levels. The whole of our bodies actually include the organs include the tissues, they include the cells. And at each level, the whole is more than the sum of the parts and can't be fully explained just in terms of the parts, let alone in terms of fundamental particles. So that general approach, you see, the holistic approach in biology has always been opposed to the reductionist approach. And so maybe you'd reframe this whole debate, but the fact is that if you take an organic view of nature, as in Whitehead's philosophy of organism, then what we see in nature is not a series of higher levels based on quantum processes, which may be indivisible and so on and interconnected and all that. But it's not like built on just that level. You see a series of levels of organization in nature, galaxies, clusters of galaxies, the whole cosmos, and always this nested holarchy of wholes within parts. And in that view, then the idea of reducing the complex to the simple isn't really relevant, because at each level there's its own level of complexity, which is irreducible.
If I may add to Rupert, and ask you, Bernardo, in that line of thinking. So I'm well aware of the work of the Santa Fe Institute on complexity science, and precisely you can reduce the complicated to the simple, but complexity science seems to make it very clear that true complex processes or systems are not reducible to simpler, precisely because they're complex in the sense of emergence, right? So how do you square your reductionism or your understanding of reductionism, which I agree is not about smaller things, but still, how do you square this with complexity science and also with what Rupert was saying?
I think complexity science lists an enormous set of examples that illustrate precisely the ability to reduce the seemingly complex to the simple. Look at cellular automata, for instance, even a simple one like Conway's Game of Life, which rule says if you have 2 or 3 living neighbors, you are either alive or you're born. Otherwise, you either stay dead or you die. Out of that comes an entire universe of things, of cannons firing bullets, birds flying around, and that's why it's called the Game of Life. But none of that is irreducible to the very simple 2-step rule that I just told. And there are other examples like that, like enormous complexity that when you find out what is the simple archetype, the simple organizing principle behind that, you realize that in fact, it's reducible to simpler things. Fractals are another example of that. A fractal rule is a very simple equation, and endless complexity emerges on your screen, stuff that you can zoom in forever, literally, and it will continue to show complexity. So if you allude to complexity science, I would say that makes more my point, I think.
Maybe there's a point of convergence here, Rupert, right? Because Bernardo seems to be talking about the simpler laws, but different levels. You still have levels that are irreducible to one another, but you can find laws that describe very well what's happening at that level of organization.
Well, I think it's a red herring, complexity theory, from the main points I was making. I actually rather agree with Bernardo that, if you have the rule of life, you have these cellular automata, you can make it look as if complex things arise. Well, they do in these simulations arise from simple rules. But the point is, that's not how living organisms actually work. I think complexity theory in the Santa Fe Institute has actually muddied the waters for understanding biology by precisely because it has an approach that is more or less, as I think Bernardo describes it, even though there are different levels emerge and so on. You see, if you take the view that I'm putting forward, obviously I've got a vested interest in this. I think that when in a developing embryo, the whole embryo is shaped by a morphogenetic field. Now, it's not just me that talks in terms of formative fields. People like Michael Levin, and it's been going on in biology for 100 years. It's not a new concept. But the field concept in physics is not about particles, really. It's about top-down organizing principles. If you have a field of a developing leaf, for example, that shapes the whole leaf and integrates the structures within it to give it its form, it's a field that's giving a top-down causation. It's not a cellular automata, a kind of granular little bits of interacting things according to a code. There's an overall global pattern which is not just a concept in our minds, but I think actually exists in the same way that a magnetic field giving pattern to iron filings along lines of force around a bar magnet. That magnetic field is a structure in space that actually exists. It's not just plus or minus that emerges from some cellular automata thing. You might be able to simulate it with a cellular automaton, but the field itself is an extended thing, and so is the gravitational field of the whole universe. This is a top-down causal structure that holds everything in place and relates all matter to everything else, which is not just sort of starting from noughts and ones and building it up. So even in physics, there's there's top-down causation as well as bottom-up causation, and fields are global organizing principles. And I think that within a plant, for example, there's a morphogenetic field for the whole leaf, and then that organizes the tissues within it, like the vascular tissue, and each cell has its own organizing field, and each organelle within the cell. And because each of these fields is a different level of organization and has an autonomous reality, there's no way they can be reduced to granular plus and minus cellular automata or simple equations, even though some of them show fractal structures like the branching pattern of veins in leaves. But it's basically that there's a kind of top-down causation which is essential in nature, even in standard physics, and which is why reductionism isn't going to work, at least in the sense that Bernardo is against it reducing the large to the small, because you won't explain the gravitational field by reducing it to particles, even hypothetical gravitational particles or gravitons, because there's something bigger than those particles which is responsible for the structure of the universe.
I'm very comfortable agreeing with all this. That's not the reductionism I endorse.
All right, so maybe that's a good moment to move on because we have many points to talk about. And it seems we will, unless you want to add something else, Rupert, about reductionism.
No, I think we mean it in. I think we've clarified this issue.
Okay, now I want to move to the second point, and there's still two more, third and the fourth. But speaking about the only plausible metaphysics, I want to ask specifically Bernardo about pluralism. But before that, I want to pick up on something that Rupert alluded in his critique of reductionism, which has to do with this strategic position you may have, and you made it very clear that you're very sincere, and I believe you, and also you made this very interesting point about concessions you want to make and you need to make in order to be able to say or write something. But I still want to ask you about strategy, because you still need to be persuasive, seductive, and there's a kind of conversion goal here in a sense, because we may come up or land at our preferred metaphysics, our preferred ism, but still we go and write papers and speak to people because we want them to also get it and convert, right? So could you say something, Bernardo, about your sincere and yet strategic stance with respect to analytic idealism?
I mean, about what analytic idealism is?
About if you have a strategy there, implicit or explicit, to persuade notorious scientists and not so notorious scientists and philosophers so that they move from physicalism or other isms to the ism that you think is the more appropriate one.
Yeah. So look, I'm never insincere. And I know this is a big statement. People cannot pin down things I've said before and confront me with that. I'm never insincere. Where I am tactical or strategic, if you want, is where I put emphasis. So my point of emphasis will change depending on who I'm speaking to. So I have certain points of emphasis when I'm talking to my friend Christoph Koch. If Rupert were here and we are having dinner together, I would have different points of emphasis, but I would not be insincere either way. I would not playing a game. Speaking broader than that, though, there is a sense in which the culture is playing a game. And that by doing what I'm doing, I am part of that game, whether I want it or not. And the game is the following. Bipedal apes are not in the business of finding ultimate truths. It would be preposterous to think that having existed with an intellect for 30 to 50,000 years, even though we exist as a species for 300,000 years, an intellect, symbolic reasoning, we have for 30 to 50,000. That we already have the cognitive system required for making sense of everything that is salient about the nature of reality. Of course we don't, right? And termites are not in the business of understanding field quantum theory or quantum field theory. But we pretend we do, because that's the cultural game. We put hypotheses forward, we defend them, others criticize them, then they are rejected, other hypotheses are put forward. So that game I must play. I will always be perceived as playing that game. So if I embrace that reality, we are playing this game, then I will say, as far as human beings and it can cognize, and as far as the data allows us to see, and as far as we make certain concessions to logic, to rationalism, to space-time, and all that, then yes, analytic idealism or something that will resemble it under a different name, I think that is the only plausible avenue. And I'll say that sincerely, knowing that I'm making all these concessions. I'm making a concession to my apehood, to my monkeyness. I'm making a concession to Aristotelian axioms. I'm making a concession to space-time, which is almost certainly not out there. It's a construct of our cognitive system. There is overwhelming evidence for it now coming even from physics, from loop quantum gravity. Given all those concessions, which are implicitly made in a book that takes an analytic position, like analytic idealism in a nutshell, and the word analytic comes first, analytical idealism, then yes, I think it can be defended under the rules of the game, but I am always aware that I'm making these concessions and I'm playing a cultural game. It's the only way to open your mouth and do something useful. If you are not willing to play by the rules of the game, then there's no point in even opening your mouth and speaking. And many people choose the latter for good reasons.
Thank you, Rupert.
Well, I think one of the rules of the game that you've chosen to play by, at least in analytical idealism, is naturalism. The idea there's nothing outside the physical universe.
No, that's not my definition, but okay, go ahead.
All right, but the point is, because physicalism has been so closely connected to naturalism for its history, the background to this really is, in the 17th century, the famous Cartesian split. Descartes managed to carve out a realm for science of nature, res extensa. The whole of nature, all matter, the whole universe is the realm of science, and it's devoid of spirit or soul. It's completely devoid of anything to do with consciousness. And the reason that worked in the 17th century is that Europe was torn apart by religious wars. The 30 Years' War on the continent, the English Civil War in England, which had strong religious ideological motivations. And so it was to have a neutral area where God, spirits and angels and demons and consciousness and subjectivity is completely excluded from the whole of nature, from this model. God then, by definition, became supernatural, outside nature, beyond nature. And by the end of the 18th century, in the ideas of deistic philosophers like Voltaire or Thomas Jefferson in America, or most of the French revolutionaries in the French Revolution, they were mainly deists. They said, yes, there's a reasonable being outside nature that designs the laws of nature, creates the mathematical laws of nature, designs the world machine, but having created the universe in the first place, then retires and nature proceeds entirely autonomously. Well, religious people were then left with the idea, or at least this defined the realm of the spirit and religion as being external to nature. And so if people wanted to go on believing in God in Christian Europe, then the view that they were forced into by their opponents, or imagined that their opponents imagined, that God's outside nature, and if there's the occasional miracle, then the finger of God has to reach in, suspend the laws of nature, do something utterly improbable, and then retreat again, leaving all the sort of standard autonomous machinery of nature functioning as before. And so the secularists, anti-Enlightenment rationalists, was sort of squeezed the realm of spirit, God, and consciousness entirely out of nature, except for this one place it still existed, was in the human mind, because Descartes thought humans still needed reason to do maths and to understand nature and to be scientists. So there was this tiny residue within nature of consciousness. But then with the rise of materialism in the 19th century, they said, well, we don't want God and angels at all. This spirit realm just simply doesn't exist. And human minds aren't special in any way. They're just the physical functioning of the brain. So this then managed to portray naturalism as the realm of science, the whole of nature devoid of consciousness, God and spirits. And then the alternative was portrayed as supernaturalism, a God from outside intervening, messing around with the course of nature in the way that's utterly and totally implausible. And then, of course, atheists say, well, of course, we don't believe in that kind of God. Well, I'm not an atheist, and I do believe in God, but I don't believe in that kind of external God either. And so the point is, the way you frame naturalism, it's been shaped in the way it's understood by this history of Europe, by the conflict, Enlightenment, rationalism, by its close association with physicalism and materialism. And I think it involves the way you portray it, is a false portrayal of theological idealisms. You see, within all religions are idealist in the sense that they all believe consciousness comes first. So if you take Advaitic Vedanta, for example, in India, they think that the ultimate reality is conscious, which they think of as Sat Chit Ananda, the being, consciousness, bliss, an internal differentiation or different aspects of this ultimate consciousness. But this is an idealist view from which the world comes forth. And then in the mythic formulations of it, for example, the idea that the god Vishnu lies down to sleep, has a dream, and that dream goes on an awfully long time, and that dream is our universe. We're in Vishnu's dream. And then he might wake up and the universe would collapse or disappear. Then he'd have another dream, it would be another universe. Well, it's very similar to modern versions of the simulation. Saying it's all just a computer simulation that we're in is just a modern technological version of Vishnu's dream. But what I'm saying is that there are these traditional forms of idealism, and including Neoplatonism, which is a European version, where in Neoplatonism you have the ultimate consciousness, then you have the world soul within that, which is the realm of the whole universe and the animating principles of the whole universe, and then all the beings, animated beings within this living universe. But that is within the ultimate consciousness. It's not that the ultimate consciousness is an external supernatural God that intervenes to bring about ridiculous miracles. It's that the ground of consciousness sustains all being. And these are just some examples of traditional idealisms which are taken seriously by theologies, but which don't even get a paragraph in analytical idealism in a bookshop, in a nutshell, because they're all ruled out at the stroke of a pen by the naturalist principle, as if they're all about external gods interfering with nature. So that's why I object to that, you see, because I think it doesn't really take seriously the traditional idealisms, including Neoplatonism, which has had a huge influence on Western theological thinking as well as philosophical thinking. It's as if they didn't exist.
If it comes across like that, it was not the intent. I do define what I mean by naturalism. I think even on page 1, or maybe 2, and it does create the space for what you describe. Here's how I see naturalism. Naturalism is the notion that nature behaves according to its own intrinsic organizing principles and not by the intervention of an agency that is fundamentally outside nature. In other words, there is only nature, but I don't define nature as physical because that would contradict analytic idealism. For me, nature is what there is. It is essentially mental. In other words, it's experiential, it's out there, it's surrounding us. And the physical world is our own cognitive representation of the subset of nature that impinges on us. In other words, it's like a dashboard, a set of dials on a dashboard giving you an indication of what you measure around the airplane. That's physicality. Physicality for me is merely representation, to use Schopenhauer's word, Vorstellung. It's not the thing in itself. It's purely representation. It's phenomenal. It's created by us. Moreover, it's a partial representation. It would be preposterous to assume that evolution would have favored our being able to pick out everything that is philosophically salient about nature. Of course, it wouldn't do that. It would pick out only what has a bearing on our fitness, our ability to survive. and reproduce. So physicality is not only a representation of nature, it's not even complete. Or if one thinks it should be complete, then the burden of argument is on that person, because every understanding of evolution suggests that there is no need for it to be complete. So my naturalism is not a naturalism that says only the physical exists, because for me, the physical is not even a thing. It's a mental representation of other mental stuff. And it's a partial one. It doesn't pick out everything that's going on around us. It's a restricted representation of that. But if you understand nature as this superset, the thing in itself as it is around us, I think that behaves according to its own archetypal, inherent, organizing dispositions or principles without intervention from an external party. But notice how much space I just created for there to be in nature that is beyond our physiologically imposed ability to represent what is around us. So everything that religious traditions have called the other world, I don't think it's another world. I think it is this world. It's just that we didn't evolve to pick it out, because there is no fitness advantage for picking it out. And it is psychic, it's spirit, it's mind, it's mental, it's experiential. Psychic would be the word from Greek. And you could even, if I understand you, because you have been fighting cultural prejudices for longer than I have been alive. The way I go about it is I try to recover words. I don't grant the words the opposition made their own. I try to reclaim them. I do not grant legitimacy to the kidnapping of certain words. And that's why I think sometimes we misunderstand each other. There is even a very precise and explicit way in which one could speak of a form of dualism, not substance dualism, but a form of dualism that does everything religious dualism would want it to do, that is entirely compatible with analytic idealism running as the operating system underneath. Because there are many dual aspects in nature. There is past and future. There is you and I. Many dualisms that are not substance dualisms. And agency dualism certainly is compatible with analytic idealism under the idea of dissociation. So you could have agent dualism, you could have the other world right here in this world, not ontologically distinct, but still transcendent from our physiologic ability to represent what's around us. You could have the whole shebang. Now, whether it's justifiable to go that far, I'm not going to tackle it. I know how far I go, but how far I go is largely also modulated by my own intuitive insight, which I can't use to defend my positions. I think I don't think I stopped too short from you, but I cannot defend it analytically. So it will come across when I'm defending an analytical argument that I stop a lot earlier than you, which may not be the case. But either way, how far I'm comfortable into granting validity to these things, it doesn't matter, because analytic idealism without change can accommodate more than I think you intuit.
Let me at this point make each of you a question. I think this is a very interesting moment of this conversation, and it's related to what's going on now. So one for you, Bernardo, and immediately one for you, Rupert, and then you take it from wherever. Bernardo, is there room for God in analytic idealism? And also at the same time that you're talking about the analytic prefix to idealism, maybe it requires another kind of idealism that is not analytic, precisely because at some point you need to draw in intuition, imagination, and so on. And at the same time, I asked Rupert, because I think that's where perhaps Rupert wanted to go, if you, Rupert, could introduce your point about the Trinitarian approach, rather than going from 2 to 1 to a monism, and from 2 to 3. All right, Bernardo, please.
Oh, me first. Look, it's a matter of how you define the word, right? If you ask me how I am comfortable using the word, I can tell you without any shame, you can catch me praying to God. Okay, if you follow me 24 hours a day, you can catch that happen. And it's not something I hide. It's not something I promote, because I can't use that to defend an analytic position. So to me, intuitively, yes. And how would I articulate that analytically? I would say, look, if you define God as an agency that is psychic in nature, is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, then it's not only possible under analytic idealism requires it, because it is the bottom of the chain of reduction, a field of subjectivity that spans the whole of nature, therefore it's omniscient. Everything that happens in nature happens by the grace of this field applying its own organizing principles to itself. So it is omnipotent, and it is the whole of nature. So it is omnipresent. And by the way, it is psychic, it is minded, because it is mind. And from that perspective, I'm quite comfortable if you define it this way. But of course, it depends on the definition. There may be 8 billion definitions of God in the world, many of them which entail an anthropomorphic God sitting in a realm ontologically distinct from nature and interfering with nature from the outside. That I don't think is, it doesn't speak to my intuition, and I cannot make an argument for that. I can make a myriad arguments against that.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with that, Bernardo. I mean, I'm a practicing Christian. I go to church, I pray on a daily basis, and so some of that, what you said, makes sense to me. And I certainly don't think of God as anthropomorphic outside of nature. I think of God in an Orthodox Christian way as the Holy Trinity. God is not a man with a white beard sitting on a cloud. It may be in some portrayals in Sunday school books he is, but the classic definition of God as recited in the Creed in many Christian services, in the Eucharist and in the Apostles' Creed, there are 2 forms usually used, but both of them are basically a statement of God as the Holy Trinity. And the Holy Trinity is God the Father is seen as the ground, the conscious ground of being. The God the Son, as the Logos, is seen as the ordering and principle of the universe, incarnated as Jesus Christ, but long preceding, right from the beginning, eternally present as part of the nature of things. And the Holy Spirit is the dynamical, moving, or energetic principle, which is manifested in nature as energy and as change. So in this vision, which is not unlike other Trinitarian idealisms in Hindu and Advaitic Vedanta, you have a knower, the ground of conscious being as part of it. You have that which is known, and then you have the energy or life or activity of the creation of the universe. And that which is known, you see, I think of as what you call the dashboard. The dashboard is, it wouldn't be any point in having a dashboard unless you could see it. And the dashboard metaphor implies someone or a consciousness that looks at the dashboard or knows the dashboard or knows the physical universe as represented by the dashboard. I think actually your ontology is implicitly Trinitarian. I think that it's crypto-Trinitarian, and by recognizing the crypto-Trinitarian, you've got a dashboard, you've got the invisible observer of the dashboard or experiencer of the dashboard, and the very fact the dashboard's there implies there's something it's a dashboard of, a plane or a car or something, which moves. The reason there's a dashboard is because it's capable of moving. It's not static. It's all about to do with reflection of movement and change. So basically, these Trinitarian models have a ground of being or consciousness, that which is what the Hindus call names and forms, nama rupa, the shapes, the forms, the patterns, the reality, what's that which is known and observed and modeled in minds through names. But there's also the dynamical principle, because if you just had that, you have a kind of static, moveless, Platonic type universe that's beyond all space and time. To get the universe we have, obviously it has time and change within it. And so this principle of change is also part of ultimate reality, not extraneous to it. And so with this view, you see, which I think is I see your philosophy as something that can actually is pointing in that direction, and it's there in embryo, as it were, a kind of Trinitarian idealism. It's in budding form. As the bud opens up, it turns into a Trinitarian idealism, and then, far from dismissing all others like Advaitic Vedanta as being supernaturalist or interventionist or whatever, it can actually recognize that actually is very closely akin to them. And so I feel that, you see, I think yours is a work in progress. I mean, Advaitic Vedanta has had thousands of years of development and discussion, so has Trinitarian theology. Whereas analytical idealism in its 21st century form is a work in progress, and it's coming closer to the territory which has already been very widely explored by these other philosophical systems.
Yeah, when I make the claim, it's the only plausible metaphysics of the 21st century, it's implicit there that it's the only plausible analytical metaphysics. So I'm comparing that with what I see in the analytical literature out there. I am keenly aware that I'm not saying anything new. I'm keenly aware that the degree of sophistication and nuance that one can bring into an analytical articulation is by construction very limited, because the analytical method prevents bringing subtlety and nuance that depend on introspective insight. Everything has to be explicit. So you're cutting off a big chunk of what you could put in there. So I'm explicitly aware of that as well. And I certainly take the world's main religious traditions very, very seriously.
Well, I think this self-denying ordinance that you have of the analytical ordinance, where you can't take seriously any subjective experience, is actually unnecessary, because even if you take science as it currently practiced, and we all agree it's very limited in the way it's done at the moment, there are now people doing research on psychedelic experiences, for example, within consciousness studies. There are people, I mean, as envisaged in your visionary work, more than allegory, there are people actually with sort of their blood pressure being measured, their electrodes on their heads, their infusions going into their brains, and people with clipboards appearing, asking them to give ratings of their state, etc., on 1 to 10 scales or something. I mean, all those things are actually happening. It's proper science, with all the trappings of science and papers in peer-reviewed journals. And yet, it's all about nothing but subjective experience. The whole thing is about subjective experience. And if they said, oh, we can't possibly talk about what these people on DMT, intravenous infusions, are actually experiencing because that's subjective, the entire research program would collapse. And we don't even need to have DMT on intravenous infusions. Just take ordinary medical research on analgesia. You know, if you're looking at pain and pain-killing drugs, I actually worked when I was 17 years old in a pharmaceutical research laboratory, screening random chemicals for analgesic properties, pain-killing properties, using guinea pigs. Well, I mean, we weren't even asking the guinea pigs, you know, whether they felt pain or not. It was expressed by them squealing. Unfortunately, these were cruel old-style experiments, and it was a terrible place to work. But the fact is that pain, which is only subjective, is a subject of scientific research. And so anyway, the point about psychedelics and also consciousness studies in its present form, it looks at near-death experiences. There are papers in scientific journals about these experiences people have when they've almost died, you know, going to other realms. It takes into account studies of lucid dreaming, studies ways in which you can induce lucid dreaming and what's going on in lucid dreams. And indeed, it's perfectly possible to study mystical experience by questionnaire methods and looking for common factors in mystical experience. So I think you're being unnecessarily conservative and in analytical idealism in ruling out what's actually already part of orthodox science that gets published in peer-reviewed journals.
There is another way to look at it if you come from the opposite extreme, which it doesn't necessarily contradict what you just said, but gives a different layer of nuance. It may be a prejudice I have, I don't know, or maybe it's justified. I think my jury is still out, but I am very suspicious of subjective noses. I'm very suspicious of people coming back from a trip and saying, oh, I've met blue aliens from the Pleiades and they are sending us heart vibrations and all that stuff. I'm very suspicious even of regular, ordinary introspection in what people report to be experiencing. I think sometimes that, well, we know that now scientifically since Jonathan Schooler's work, there are dissociations between consciousness and meta-consciousness. In other words, you don't always report accurately, even to yourself, what it is that you are experiencing. And the mind tends to weave all kinds of narratives to tell itself what it is that it is doing. And often those are wrong. I have this thing I repeat often. I say, mind's first directive is to deceive itself. And I have observed this in me several times, enough to give me comfort that at least with me, this is the case. My mind tries to deceive itself very, very often. It has to really be guarded. I have to really be careful with it. And that's why I have this potential prejudice. I'm suspicious of subjective first-person noses. And I think in neuroscience, and that's a conversation I have often with Christoph and sometimes with Giulio, that how neuroscience becomes even more important under idealism, in my view, because of what is now called the no-report paradigm in consciousness science that Nao Tsuchiya proposed back in 2015, 10 years ago, which is the idea that you cannot take subjective reports on face value. Often what's going on is something else, and we can derive clues about that by examining neuroactivity, which under analytic idealism is what inner experience looks like when represented on the dashboard. So despite the representational limitations of the dashboard, that gives us a sort of a direct, more objective access to mental activity than to rely purely on subjective reports. So I think you recognize all this, but it won't contradict what you said. It's a matter of from which extreme you start your discourse, right?
Well, yes. I mean, if you look at it start from the so-called objective point of view, namely regular science as normally practiced, scientists have spent a lot of time, decades, centuries, arguing against subjective experience as a valid data. Secondary qualities, Galileo dismissed as, just being produced in minds and not like primary qualities, mass, matter, with volume, etc., things you can measure quantitatively. There's been this long prejudice against them in favor of this objective method. However, it turns out, as you know from the recent replication crisis, that most papers in scientific journals can't be reproduced, and so-called objective evidence that science has always prided itself on, as opposed to subjective experience, turns out to be riddled with errors. People only publish their best results. Most of it's non-reproducible. So it's not as if we've got perfect objective science here and then muddled up subjectivity that's unreliable here. It's all unreliable, and I think one of the things about studying subjective introspective experience is not taking on trust that everything everyone says is really just as they say it is. But one of the scientific methods is the ability to generalize. If you study thousands of people who've had near-death experiences, and most of them say 90% of them say they felt themselves floating out of their body, they went through a kind of tunnel, they were in a state of bliss where they found beings of light, etc., then it seems to me that the normal scientific method would say, well, these reports, they agree with each other. Maybe they're illusory, but they're all having a very similar kind of illusion. And this tells us something about the state and experience of consciousness. And it may be something that we ourselves may have. Lots of other people have had it. It tells us something useful and interesting, and it's not just to be distrusted or dismissed. So it seems to me that criterion, I think you're being much too strict and unnecessarily so, and possibly giving far too much credit to so-called regular objective science, which no longer looks quite as objective as it did 20 or 30 years ago, when it was taken for granted that everything in peer-reviewed journals was basically reproducible, it all been through peer review, all been checked, it was solid and stuff. It's not like that at all.
Let me come in here and ask something that's related to that and make explicit another topic, a big topic that I wanted to bring, which is the overlap and exchange transactions between philosophy and science. I think we consider ourselves philosophers and scientists at the same time. And so there's something about philosophy which I don't want to simplify, but all these metaphysical positions have been there for many, many centuries. And of course, one needs to update them and evolve them and contextualize them. So in that sense, philosophy also has work in progress, but it also seems to me that it's there. In a way, it's a kind of perennial knowledge, because you can always go back to, as Rupert was saying, to the Neoplatonisms or to Plato, to Aristotle, and find the kernels there. Now we have this other view on science, which I sometimes doubt, which is it is progressing. But anyways, after 400 years, that's my summary, since Galileo, we've realized with consciousness studies and neuroscience in particular, that this first distinction was very fruitful for many years and centuries. But now this division between objective and subjective doesn't work anymore. And in particular, myself and many others who I see in this call are trying to do a new science of consciousness and maybe a new science period. So based on what Rupert was saying a minute ago and what you said before, two reflections here. One, it seems that the objectivity of science is homologous to the analyticism of your philosophy as a bedrock on which you can build. And that's kind of a good place to build. But I feel we need more. And so how can we use those isms, be it a Trinitarian approach or analytical idealism, to make them really useful for science and to make progress and to design new experiments and to get into the subjective, which I don't think scientists really know how to do it yet. And I'm not saying that your philosophy needs to be falsifiable. And I also don't believe in this kind of obsession, right? Popperian obsession. But yeah, let's talk a bit more in these final minutes before we open it up for Q&A, if you may want to comment on that, on the intersection between science and philosophy, and how to make a progress in, I think, what we're all also trying, which is there is this thing called mind, as Rupert was beautifully describing. It's been kind of enclosed to the pineal gland, then the brain, then the body with the inactivist, and now to the world and maybe everywhere. How can we serve science? How can we help science to move forward?
Yeah, I think revising certain sort of knee-jerk reactions we have had in the past and which are mistakes would go a long way. Let me make it concrete. We think because technology is so successful, has been so successful for the past 250 years, since the Industrial Revolution, that this endorses some form of metaphysics, like physicalism. That's a mistake. It's like saying that a gamer who wins the world championship playing a certain game understands the hardware and software underneath. You don't need to understand it to play the game. You can have just a useful fantasy, a useful fiction to play the game. Same for technology. I am a technologist. I know how technologists work. We don't give a damn about what's true. We only worry about what works. So we use Fourier optics, which is not true, but works. We use Newtonian mechanics, which is not true, but works. We use discrete element transmission line theory. It's not true, but works. Finite element theory. Not true, but works. So that's one mistake. Another mistake is because we attributed so much to the scientific method by sort of understanding how technology arises from it, we think that science is the only epistemic methodology for acquiring knowledge about what's going on. That's a mistake, and it's dangerous for science itself, because often a methodology, the strength of a methodology resides in its very limitations. So in the case of science, limiting what is considered valid under the scientific method is largely responsible for the reliability of the scientific method regarding what it can be applied to. The mistake is now to say, and it can be applied to everything. Obviously, it cannot. Obviously, it cannot be applied to the nuances of introspection, to the multi-layers of meaning that are playing within us at all times. It cannot be applicable there. And then we make a mistake. We say, well, then we should cut off the limitations of the scientific method so we can apply it everywhere. That's where we lose science, I think. And if you can do the same thing for avenues of introspection, like certain methods of introspection that go under the label spiritual or religious. I'm not going to fight the label, it's just an observation. If you try to turn them into a science, you lose them. You will lose the depth that they can give you. So I am more comfortable with embracing a multitude of methods so we can apply the correct tool at the correct time and not try to hammer in a screw or screw down a nail. I think that's a mistake we often make. That said, I'm very cognizant of what Rupert just brought up, the crisis of replicability in science. That happens mainly in psychology. Up to 60% of psychology papers turn out not to be reproducible, but it's in other areas of science as well. And that started happening the moment we turned science into a salaried paid profession, as opposed to a patronized activity. And by that, I mean, you have a patron, he thinks what you're doing is fine, he doesn't put any other constraint on you, and it just gives you the resources to do that. That's how science started, in the academia in Greece. But the moment we turn that into a job like any other, now there are these job pressures, you have to publish or die, as they say in academia. And then all kinds of human things pop up, because humans are imperfect and science is done by humans. I don't think, however, that these true problems, vast and extremely serious problems, necessarily translate into a problem with the methodology of science. I think they translate into how that methodology is applied by human beings who get salaries and have egos and want to grow in their careers and be rich and famous and all that stuff, not necessarily the methodology. So I may be a bit of a scientific chauvinist in that sense. The scientific methodology for me, because of how I grew up, how I was educated, it's almost a holy thing. And which it shouldn't be, right? I should be more neutral and more objective about it, but that's how I experience it. And the methodology, the scientific methodology itself is almost an ideal form for me. And of course, what we make of it is a mess. But to me, that doesn't reflect on that idealized methodology, which is one tool in a box that should have more tools.
Now, Rupert, I don't think you think science can be applied to everything. That would be scientism in a way, but you've definitely been trying, and I would say succeeding in extending it. So do you want to go that route in adding to what Bernardo just said?
Well, there's 2 or 3 points actually I'd like to make. First of all, yes, I think scientific methodology could be extended much beyond where it has gone so far. Partly because I do research on psychic phenomena like telepathy and the sense of being stared at, scoposthesia. Now, most scientists don't research in these areas because they assume they're impossible or they're just superstitions. And they've created a huge amount of very unscientific prejudice when it comes to these areas. So I'm in favor of extending scientific methods to areas where they haven't been extended before. That's what I spend a lot of my time doing. I mean, I'm an experimental scientist, and I spend a lot of my time thinking of and actually doing experiments. So I'm in favor of it. I agree with the importance of the scientific method of hypothesis, testing hypotheses, evidence, designing experiments. That's what I do. But on the more general point of the interactions of philosophy and science, here in England, the word scientist didn't really become used until the 19th century. Before that, it was called natural philosophy. And Sir Isaac Newton's great book, Principia Mathematica, is called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. That's its title. And in Cambridge, the University Scientific Society is called the Cambridge Philosophical Society. And it's all the lectures are all about science, and it's a journal like the Biological Reviews, in which I've published reviews myself, is called the Biological Reviews of the Cambridge Philosophical Society. So I actually think that we need to recover the sense of natural philosophy, the philosophy of nature. And I think one area it's happening is through panpsychism. The panpsychist philosophy, which is another reaction against physicalism or materialism, it's somewhat distinct from idealism, is saying that there are many kinds of sources of consciousness or subjectivity in nature, not just inside human minds and animal brains. The normal view of consciousness that we have in science is intensely cerebrocentric. It's confined to brains in an otherwise totally unconscious universe. But if you take a panpsychist view, then electrons and atoms might have some kind of subjectivity. They might have feelings. Pan-experientialism is another way of describing it. And what might the feeling of an electron be like? Well, electrons have the same kind of feelings that we do. They have attractions and repulsions. They're repelled by other electrons. They're attracted towards positive charges. And so we actually call them attractions. And some of our most basic feelings are of attraction and repulsion. We see them in nature at all levels. One reason Newton's theory of gravitation wasn't taken seriously in France for a generation or two was because he talked of gravitational attraction, and the French thought this was just an animistic projection onto nature. How could brute matter possibly feel an attraction? So I think that if we take panpsychism seriously, then there's a kind of subjectivity inherent in self-organizing systems. And I myself have explored this most explicitly in connection with the sun. As you both know, I wrote a paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies called Is the Sun Conscious?, arguing that the sun might have its own thoughts, feelings, imaginings, activities, decisions. Now, this is another point where Bernardo and I disagree. We've had a discussion about this once before, which is why I know we disagree about it. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to the bottom of this evening. But I think there's a kind of autonomous subjectivity inherent in the sun, in stars, in whole galaxies, maybe in cells, in atoms, in systems that all self-organizing systems at all levels of complexity may have an inner life, as it were, and a point of view. They may experience the world from within, in the sense from wherever they are, they see the universe from that point of view. A bit like Leibniz's monads, where each one reflects the universe from its own point of view, which is different from every other monad's point of view. Now, when we talked about this before, I thought that analytical idealism would be all in favor of this kind of panpsychism. Turns out it's not. There is a kind of, I'm paraphrasing Bernardo and he can put it better himself, but there is a kind of subjectivity in all these self-organizing systems, but it's not a kind of autonomous subjectivity centered right there. It's just a kind of derivative from the subjectivity of the entire cosmos, insofar as everything participates in it, but it's not, as it were, localized and semi-autonomous. And so that I think is a distinction between panpsychist philosophies, of which there are several varieties today. There always have been, but just as analytic idealism is one reaction against mechanistic or physicalistic approach to nature, panpsychism is another. So I'd actually be quite interested, Bernardo, to know how what your position is on this, because it is a philosophical difference, panpsychism versus idealism, but it also has scientific consequences. And I think the consciousness of the sun, for example, could be tested experimentally. This isn't the moment to go into that. But anyway, I'd like to know what you think about it.
But before I even tackle that, just a quick observation. I see absolutely no reason why the scientific method cannot be applied to parapsychology. I think it's overwhelmingly clear that it has been successfully and can continue to be. So nothing of what I said before was meant to contradict this. I'm entirely with you there. The parapsychology is not beyond one of those limitations that I endorsed. Not at all. I see no reason why it can't be applied there. Under analytic idealism, matter is always only a outside appearance of mental processes. So there is no matter that doesn't correspond to experience. The question is, where are the boundaries of those experiences? Does the boundary of the related experience correspond with the boundaries of an object? That's the question. For instance, to give you a relatable example, there is something it is like to be me. There is something it is like to be my head, my body, but I cannot access what it is like to be a single neuron in my head separate from the other neurons. So the question is, if I hold this bottle of water, is there something it is like to be this bottle of water? I think this bottle of water is part of what mental processes look like. All matter is part of what mental processes look like. But is there a mental process whose boundaries, dissociative boundaries, correspond to the boundaries of the bottle? I don't think so. And the reason for this, it's almost linguistic, Rupert. We tend to think of things as everything we have a word for. But that obviously is arbitrary. For instance, we have a word for fist. But where is the fist? The fist disappeared. Well, no, there was no fist. The word was a nominal thing we created for convenience. Same thing for a car. If we say, I would define the boundaries of the car in terms of functionality. In other words, it will include everything it needs to move. So the spark plugs are part of the car, just like a neuron is part of my brain. Well, if you're consistent with that, then for the car to move, you need a road that the tires grip. You need the gravity that pulls the tires towards the road. You need the air for combustion. Actually, you need the sun that produced the plants that went underground and cooked for 350 million years that produced the hydrocarbons that you then burn in the engine. And if you take then quantum entanglement into account, then suddenly you realize that there are no things. There is only the inanimate universe as a whole, in the same way that there is no river and there is no ocean. Otherwise, you have to tell me precisely where the boundary between the two is located, right? So we confuse the structure of language, which is nominal and developed for convenience. We confuse that with the ontological structure of the word, of the world. So I think often the panpsychist falls for this. The panpsychist will say the fist is conscious. Well, no, because there is no fist. Things you have a word for are not necessarily actual, proper parts of the world. We carve out these artificial boundaries purely for convenience. And ultimately, there is only the inanimate universe. There are no things within it. So under that understanding, I can agree with you and say everything is conscious. The question is, what is a real thing? It's not just the things we have words for. I think the only real thing that exists is the inanimate universe as a whole. Now, briefly commenting on that paper on the Journal of Journal of Consciousness Studies about the sun, I will grant you that that was the best attempt at articulating a panpsychist hypothesis for a sun having a conscious inner life of its own, for the sun actually being a proper part of the universe. It's the best attempt I have seen.
Well, thank you for that. I think we could go on forever, and Alex has got his eye on the time because the half-hour question period should be starting any second. But I'm not saying that anything we can give a name to is conscious, and I think most panpsychists that I've talked to see that it applies only to self-organizing systems. They don't think rocks, tables, chairs, or socks are conscious, but they think that atoms, electrons, cells, birds, and so on, or stars might be. And I think that the difference here is it a center of consciousness? For me, I am a kind of panpsychist. I think the fist is not a center of consciousness. The fist is a way in which my consciousness moves the body around. It's within my consciousness, but it's not itself a center of consciousness. But I'm a center of consciousness. I'm a self-organizing system. And I don't think the consciousness I have is confined to the inside of my skin, because one of the whole points of a lot of my work on the sense of being stared at, and a paper that Alex and I wrote jointly on the extended mind, is that minds are not confined to the inside of the objects of which they're the center of consciousness. When I see my image of you on my computer screen right now, I think that image is where it is on the screen. I don't think it's inside my head. When I think all vision involves an extension of the mind far beyond the boundaries of the body. And I think that the feeling of an electron of being attracted towards a positive charge is that feeling, although the electron is the center of, as it were, of consciousness of that feeling or center of experience, it wouldn't be able to have that unless it was part of an extended awareness that was aware of the presence of a positive charge at some distance beyond the wave pattern of the electron itself. So I think that what I think of is in terms of centers of consciousness, and rather than all just being diffusely part of the consciousness of the entire universe or the whole of nature, I think there are these localizations of centers of consciousness within some kinds of systems, not within fists, but within a human body and within and around a human body. I'm sure we could discuss this indefinitely, but Alex is looking at the time.
Oh, well, I'm thinking of asking yet one more question. Forgive me, but I must. It's of vital importance. Bernardo, are we like fists so that when we die, we're gone? Or is there something that survives? I think Rupert believes and thinks that something survives. I'm not now sure whether you think Bernardo or Alex or Rupert, there'll be something left of us when we die.
I think Bernardo is something nature is doing. Bernardo is not a thing, not a separate agency. It's a doing of nature. And therefore, whatever exists now will continue to exist after nature stops doing Bernardo, because Bernardo is not a thing, it's a doing. That's my view. I think the doing question is a dissociative process, a dissociative doing, which is the reason why we can't read each other's thoughts. And I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda right now. But essentially what our core subjectivity is, the I behind the eyes, not your narrative self, that person who was born and that date and is married to that other person and does this or that for a living. No, that's a narrative self. That's just a story. But the subjectivity behind my eyes, I think, is the only thing that truly exists. It's the same subjectivity behind your eyes, behind Rupert's eyes, the same subjectivity behind the inanimate universe. It's the only thing that has ever been, is, and there will ever be. So I don't think any truly existent dies ever. It would be a violation of even some scientific principles. But I think certain things, certain processes, some doings stop. So if Bernardo Kastrup is the name of a particular doing, yes, I think that doing stops. Good riddance, hopefully. I certainly wouldn't like to be in this state of consciousness so prone to suffering forever. It may also be possible, but that's a much longer discussion. I don't know whether you want to have that. It may also, it is defensible empirically and conceptually that life memories persist. Not only that they remain coherent because of the cross evocation given their emotional charge. In other words, they stay coherent as a semantic web. And when the dissociation ends, that may persist, but now not bound by dissociation. In other words, it's drifting in our cognitive neighborhood, the whole life complex. And the reason I say that is largely empirical, that there is now too much evidence that memories cannot be found in the brain. They are not little computer files. They may be direct access to natural states that we define as being past states.
This may sound familiar to Rupert, I suppose, with morphic resonance, right?
Yes.
But gentlemen, if you don't mind, we'll leave it here. It's been delightful. And now let's open it up for Q&A, where there'll be time, I'm sure, to rephrase or extend on certain points. So raise your hand, we'll find you.
Yes, you can use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen under reactions. Veronica, please come in and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Paris Center and everybody. I have a question for Bernardo. By the way, I really enjoy your conversations with thinking aloud and also with absolute philosophy. Yeah. So the question is, I'm a little confused. Remember when you talked about psychic agency, when you were talking about Trinity, both of you? You mentioned psychic agency, but then you also said that, or I can be wrong, and that's my question, that mind at large is instinctive in nature. So are you talking about two different things, mind at large and a psychic agency, or are they the same, and is it instinctive in nature? I mean, in its nature.
I define mind at large as that segment of the one field of subjectivity that nature is, the segment that is not caught in a dissociative process. In other words, after you account for all life, mind at large are the mental processes that are left over. I think higher level mental functions, such as self-awareness, metacognition, I think there is sufficient evidence to, at least for now, infer that they have evolved given the pressures of natural selection, and they are not built into the very fabric of nature. If that is the case, then mind at large would not have evolved these higher level mental functions. That may in fact have to do with the very meaning of life. We may be God's metacognitive eyes to spy on itself. Like Jung described in his analysis of the book of Job, that was exactly the idea there, and the incarnation of Jesus afterwards being God's way to sort of get a handle on that and trying to see it for himself, so to say. There's rich symbolism in all that. So no, I don't think mind at large, if I make the concession to space-time, I don't think mind at large right now is metacognitive, self-aware. It may be highly intelligent, because we know from savants and acquired savants that intelligent can be endless without being accompanied by metacognition.
Right.
It's just spontaneous. It's still extremely intelligent. It's a sophisticated way to process data, but it's not accompanied with the, I know that I am doing this and that, and I'm taking these steps. I don't think this metacognitive property is there in the fabric of nature if I grant space-time. But of course, if you withdraw from that concession, if you say nature is what I call it the crystal of eternity, a semantic web, a linked semantic web that exists all at once forever outside time. And we are just traversing this through life, through a cognitive slit to avoid cognitive overload. If you start from that and you don't concede space-time, then whatever nature is going to, whatever properties it is developing through the drama of life evolving within confined ecosystems, outside time, it's already there. And then outside time, then all the bets are off. But if I concede space-time, right now, I think that mind at large is instinctive. Yes.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you for coming in.
Let me add,
can I ask you to come in?
Yeah, and while Paul is coming, let me say there are many hands as expected, and not that much time, although we've been here for more than an hour and a half. I would suggest everyone that wants to ask a question, in case there's no time to pose it live, if you don't mind, write it in the chat, and so then other people can read it, So maybe it spurs some thoughts on people. Other people may want to try to answer it or comment on it on the chat, and then we can share the chat around, and Bernardo and Rupert may be able to read them later.
Yeah, I
We
propose.
won't be...
I think the next question will go to Rupert anyway, but I need to take a very short 30-second bio break, and I'll be right back. Yeah.
Yes. All right. All yours, Paul. Unless you wanted to ask specifically to Bernardo.
Yeah. Well, it's a question to Bernardo, yes. Of this rather curious position on subjectivity. So,
Rupert, do you want to comment on something based on the previous question while Bernardo is coming back?
Not particularly, no. Why don't we have a question that's more for me and then come back to the one for Bernardo?
All right, let's see. Christine, I think Christine is raising her thumb.
I have a very short question for Rupert, so it'll fit in nicely. Rupert, sorry to put you on the spot, but do you believe that God is male? And if you don't believe that, why do you use language like Lord and God the Father, rather than language like God the Source or Mother, Father, God? Because this, to me, appears to perpetuate a sort of a medieval mindset, and it's particularly sort of pertinent and problematic in light of the way the Abrahamic religions treat women.
Well, actually, because I think God's the Holy Trinity, I think God's they. I think, a lot of people have wrestled with this. I'm a member of the Church of England. We now have women priests and women bishops. There's a lot of discussion. You could say, if you say, well, God's it's she, then that's also gendering God unnecessarily. Obviously, God is beyond gender. Obviously. I mean, it has to be the supreme consciousness of the entire universe is not male or female, obviously contains all polarities, all differences. But the problem with language is that if you say it, which is neither male nor female, then that's the word we use for unconscious, inanimate beings. And if God is a supreme consciousness, that's not very satisfactory either. So anyway, I think that the discussion about gender and people wanting to be called they, because they're non-binary, does actually apply perfectly to the Holy Trinity. The Holy Trinity is non-binary. By definition, it's 3, not 2, and it's therefore non-binary. And it's plural in the sense that it's they. So I don't think of God, although I use the language when I say the Lord's Prayer every day. I mean, I say, Our Father who art in heaven. I do use that language as traditional language, but I certainly don't think of God as being male or female, but I think of God as being beyond all gender and as an ultimate consciousness of the universe. Could hardly be the ultimate consciousness of the entire universe, stars and galaxies and planets and electrons and atoms, if it's all about human genitalia or even animal genitalia. It's clearly far beyond all that.
Thank you, Christine. Paul, do you want to come back in and ask your question?
Yes, I wish we had another couple hours. There's so much, so many interesting things coming from Bernardo and Rupert, but I'm going to limit myself to one question, and that's to me, a curious position that Bernardo has on subjectivity. I mean, you've been very clear expressing your how you question and how you're mistrustful to subjectivity. Yet, I think your whole statement about consciousness, all this, very courageous and interesting travel that you made to understand consciousness, very often comes from subjective experience, from people essentially, I've heard it many, many times from just the travels to non-ordinary states. Plato, if you go back to Idealism, he obviously took Kaikion, which had substance similar to it. There are not different ways one can get into non-ordinary states, from hypnosis to holotropic breathwork and the psychedelics. But I've heard this conviction that everything is consciousness at least 500 times, and all were people who went into non-nervous state. So it makes me wonder whether your conviction also comes from a subjective experience that now for a couple of decades you are trying to explain.
Yeah, but I understand why you're asking this question. It gives me an opportunity also to clarify it. I am skeptical of particular narratives, specific narratives that arise from non-ordinary states of consciousness or other forms of subjective experience. My first reaction is to be skeptical, but the skepticism is about particular narratives. Now, underlying the narratives, there are insights that are not narrative-based. I will give you a concrete example. I had my first psychedelic trip as a 30-odd years old adult. And I read a lot before I did it. I went to my doctor, had my heart checked out, my liver checked out. And it was really like a research project, because at that point I was already writing about consciousness, and I thought it's irresponsible for somebody who is writing about consciousness not to have this experience that everybody's talking about right now.
Absolutely.
So I started at low doses, went to very high doses, which Rupert's friend Terence McKenna used to call heroic doses, and then beyond that, because it turned out I have a very hard head. You know, anything below 5 dried grams doesn't really get me there.
And at that point, one has fully convincing experience that everything is
well, here comes the subtlety. I also had the experiences that other talks about. Entities, other dimensions, weird stuff, spaceships, other universes. I had all that. And all of that was accompanied by a sense of hyper-reality. Like it felt not only real, but more real than this. What was the conclusion I extracted when I came back? It was not that all of that was real in the way it seemed to be. The conclusion I derived from it is my mind can engender a sense of reality. Always. It can always convince itself of the product of its imagination. To me, what that meant is that this right now is an instance of the same process. In other words, what it convinced me of is not that the contents of my psychedelic trips were physical in a parallel dimension. What it convinced me of is that this right now is not physical the way it seems to be, because the fact that I'm convinced that it is what it seems to be could be replicated during a psychedelic trip, even with a heightened sense of reality. So I'm extracting conclusion from a meta belief. If belief is, I believe at face value in the experiences I had, that's what I will call belief. The meta belief is mind can create that belief. And therefore mind is primary. And therefore the same thing might be happening right now. This too is of the same kind, the same ontic kind as what happened in the psychedelic trip. And then you get to the same place. The psychedelic trip is as valid as this, but going the other way around.
I thought you liked things simple.
And therefore, the conclusion is very simple. Mind is primary. Everything else is a narrative. That's the conclusion. It's simple, almost dry. It honors mind for what it is, because we owe creation to the mind's instinctive disposition to imagine. Without it, this field of subjectivity that I think nature is wouldn't be self-excitable. In other words, it would do nothing. Nothing would exist. But it is self-excitable. It falls in love with its own narratives all the time. It's Tristan and Isolde. It's locked into a dance with itself of pure love, right? Intense emotional experience, and that creates reality. So I honor all that, but my way to that conclusion is different than taking things at face value.
Well, thank you for sharing with us your line of thinking. That's understandable. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Paul,
you, Paul.
for coming in. Jack, would you like to join us?
Thanks for the discussion. this is a question for Bernardo, but relating to Rupert's comments. Bernardo, I know in the past you've explored the idea of complexes in the mind of nature. Could the sun be a complex, as in something not as well defined as a human, but still some kind of center of consciousness, as Rupert mentioned?
It could. Yeah, there is no way to a priori dismiss that possibility. Not only that, Rupert made an articulation based on the patterns of electromagnetic fields in the sun and the way they sort of turn in upon themselves again. And if you apply integrated information theory to those patterns, you may get some level of integrated information. And also, the sun stands in a vacuum in space. Arguably, it's projecting out its photons, but relatively speaking, it's not receiving much signaling from what is outside of it. It is certainly a self-propelled fusion nuclear reaction. And in that sense, certainly self-organizing. There's nothing else organizing it. And it's very complex. So from an in-principle perspective, I would say, yes, it's possible. And to say that it is the case isn't even arbitrary. I wouldn't go that far, though. I would stay more cautious. And the reason for that is, and it's an empirical argument, we only know that we are conscious. And then to extrapolate from that, you start to have to look for similarities between you, analogies between you and something else that you want to infer. Is it also conscious or not? The way I am. I know I am. So other human beings, that's immediate. They're analogous to me in every sense. They manifest the same external behaviors. Very safe to say they are conscious too. And by the way, I think it's immoral to question whether human beings and other living beings are conscious. I think it is so self-evident, it breaches the boundary of morality if you say they are not, or even bring up that question. I can extrapolate that line based on similarity throughout life. Why do I do that? Because life is a very particular thing. It has some unique characteristics that you don't find anywhere else in nature. A protein folding, it's difficult stuff, happens in 2 seconds in the body. It takes a supercomputer, I don't know how long, to figure out how to fold a protein. It's unique stuff. Transcription, ATP generation and burning. I mean, there's so much unique stuff happening in life. And not only that, it's common to all life. Even though I am completely different from a fruit fly, the fruit fly, if you look with the microscope, is the same as me. It's metabolizing things. Even the biochemistry of DNA is the same, which it wouldn't need to be. It's multiple realizable, the biochemistry of DNA. You could achieve that with other compounds, other atoms, other molecules. So life, if you look carefully, is very analogous, all life. And all life manifests external behaviors that in our case, we attribute to the existence of conscious inner life. For instance, amoeba build little vases from mud particles in the puddle where they live to protect themselves. They build little houses for themselves, you know? So I think we are safely justified to say, based on analogy and self-knowledge, all life has private conscious inner life. I would be cautious going beyond that, which doesn't mean that I'm right. I may be proven wrong. I'm just not ready to go that far yet.
Okay.
Rupert, would you want to add something on this because it touches on the sun?
No, I think it's fine what Bernardo said.
Do we have time for one more, or should we bring it to a close? What do you think, Rupert, Bernardo?
I'm happy.
We've been going on for.
I'm happy to stay a little longer, but then I would propose that Rupert gets the questions now, and then I stay a little longer.
Yeah, I think one more. Yes.
Thank you, Rupert. Let's go for one more then.
David.
Thank you, Parry Center, for organizing this, and thank you both for this discussion. You've exemplified the way these difficult things should be explored and exploring differences. My question is about objectivity and subjectivity, which you've talked a lot about. Isn't it the fact that all experience is subjective, and what we do is in scientific inquiry is intersubjectively explore subjective experiences. If we take the metaphor of the dashboard, it's easy to think of every dial you can read numbers on it. But the dashboard isn't like that. The dashboard is exuding smells and tastes and such. And what science has done is says, well, some of these we can rig so that we can count them. And this is the easy thing to compare intersubjectively. And then it's gone a stage further and said that only the things that we can explore by counting them exist. And it is, or either it's the only thing that exists, or it's not bother. Let's not bother about exploring the other things. So that's my question to both of you.
Well, I think it's true. All our experience is subjective, and the experience of scientists looking at dials on machines or measuring things is subjective as well. And science, in a sense, you could say the objectivity of science is a kind of intersubjectivity. I read a paper recently, and I'm sorry I've forgotten the authors, where they pointed out that what we normally think of as scientific objectivity involves collapsing things from 3 dimensions to 2, or even to 1, that scientific evidence for something is represented, for example, in a graph or a chart. And it's 2-dimensional because scientific papers are published on paper in journals, and paper's 2-dimensional. So scientific evidence is almost by definition 2-dimensional because it has to be in scientific journals to be real, and there is always on a 2-dimensional page. And and most people say that, if someone says, I've seen a UFO, or a UAF, or whatever they're called nowadays, someone say, oh, that's just you. You might have hallucinated or made it up. So, show us a photograph. And so as soon as they show a photograph, aha, well, there is something really there, because it's been reduced to 2 dimensions. You see, photos are 2-dimensional too. And they say, well, I want to see how something actually works. And they say, well, okay, I'll show you a video animation. Well, that's 2-dimensional. So actually, this paper that I read, I thought, gosh, that's so true, that what we normally think of as objective is we've just collapsed a dimension. And as soon as you put back 3 dimensions, it becomes subjective again. So scientific objectivity is, as you rightly say, I think, intersubjective agreement, and it doesn't always agree, of course. But I think this point about reducing it to 2 dimensions it really corresponds to the experience of doing science. And whenever I design experiments, I have in mind how I can express the results, and it's going to be in a graph or a bar diagram or in a table of columns of figures and stuff. That's what we've got used to. Anyway, that's my main reflection on your point.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
All right. I would like to be respectful of the time we set, so I think it's time to close. And I would just like to add how delightful this has been. Being used to debates where you go from 2, like the Mad Max movie, 2 men or women come in and 1 comes out. I feel like 2 came in and 3 came out. Like there was something else that was learned, I think. And also I wanted to say that it's obvious that we had these 2 great minds with strong intellectual power, but there was a grace in which you 2 moved around. So I was thinking, I don't know, horses were coming to mind, like not beasts fighting, but just like the power and the beauty and the grace of horses just moving around as we were discussing about all of these. And I also had the sense of, I don't know if that even exists, heterogeneous conversions. I think we conversed on things, but we did it in a heterogeneous way. And well, that hardly ever happens. So thank you very much. And now I'll leave you, if you have 1 minute, 30 seconds to just say some final words.
I was delighted with this. My heartfelt goal was to get closer to Rupert, because I think the distance that we appear to have was somewhat illusory. I think we reapproached. We have a deeper understanding of each other's position.
Well, I agree with that, and I'm really pleased this happened. And thank you for Bernardo for taking part, and thank you, Alex, for making it possible. And thank you to the PARI Center for providing a platform where this can happen, not just in PARI, but over the whole world, in such an inclusive way, and happen in real time as well. I think it's very important that we could do this live and unedited, and so I just feel grateful.
Wonderful.
Thank you
All
too.
right.
I appreciate it as well.
So have a good night, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time.